So this video here, guys, may offend a lot of people when it comes to those that are doing research on climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. And the reason that it tends to offend a lot of people is because we get so stuck on when you look at a mountain, what route would you choose? So on Kilimanjaro, you got Lemosho, you got Shira, you got Machame, you got Umbwe, you got Ranga, you got Marangu. There's others, but those are ascent routes. So when you're climbing up that mountain, which would you choose? Now, when you first are doing research, the most widely used today is Machame route. Okay, and the reason for that is it makes sense for acclimatization. It's a beautiful route. It's on the southwestern part of Mount Kilimanjaro National Park. And that's what the majority of people use. Now, from the past, the Coca-Cola route, the Marangu route, that's what used to be the most widely used. And that's actually on the southern eastern slope of Mount Kilimanjaro National Park. Now it's starting to trend toward the eastern side. Okay, you have two routes. You have Lemosho and you have Shira, specifically Lemosho route. Okay, and you find that that takes a long time to climb. So you have Lemosho, I've touched on. You have Shira, I've touched on. I've touched on the Machame, and I've touched on the Marangu route. That leaves two routes that I haven't talked about yet. And the Rongai route is coming from the northeastern side of the mountain, just by the Kenyan border. And that's a route that takes a long time to get to, depending on where you're located in Tanzania. And then lastly, you have Umbwe route. Now, Umbwe route, if you do your research on it, okay, it will have the distinction of being the most difficult route up Mount Kilimanjaro. And it's not wrong, but it's not right either. Okay? So when it comes to anybody that will talk to me, anybody that will reach out to me as far as getting information about climbing Kilimanjaro, and I send out our detailed information package. And when it comes down to the route selection, and you see Umbwe route, and then the next moment people will do their research on it and say, why the hell is Paul and Mountain Climbing Adventures recommending the Umbwe route when it's the most difficult route? And when you talk to me, okay, there's certain aspects as a mountain guide and running a mountain guiding company that you really want to make sure that clients are safe, clients enjoy the trip, and clients are going to be successful, right? So if you can do those three things, you're going to run a successful company, and you're going to make sure that people will talk great about their experience on Mount Kilimanjaro. So why do we pick Umbwe? Well, let's backtrack first. Let's talk about each specific one. So let's start on the northern site, and we have the Rongai route. Now, disclaimer, you're talking about a person who's been climbing Mount Kilimanjaro since the 90s, okay, guiding people, thousands and thousands of people up this mountain. I've done every route multiple times. I've done, I'm not limited to any route selection, so it's not that it's a limitation for me to say I'm only limited to one route selection. And then number three is, where am I coming from? I'm always coming from the perspective of you enjoy your trip, you're successful on your trip, and you're going to be safe on the trip. Okay? So let's start with the Rongai route. The Rongai route tends to have the most gradual slope up. So of all the grades, the eastern side of the mountain tends to be a little easier on the lower to middle part of the mountain. Okay, so that's actually not a bad thing because it sort of gets your legs attuned to it, to the mountain. The acclimatization process on the Rongai route isn't necessarily bad, but the problem is that when you get to the Rongai route, you're going to summit at a high point that's going to be a lot longer to get to the true summit. Okay, there's Gilman's Point, it's called. Okay, and Gilman's Point is tough because once you get to the crater rim, let's call it 19,000 feet, it's going to be at least 2.5, maybe sometimes 3 hours for people to get to the actual summit. Okay? That is, in itself, I look at that, you want to limit the time that you spend at the top of any mountain, including Kilimanjaro. So that brings you down to the not the Marengo route, which has always been known as the Coca-Cola route, the most used brand, okay, over the history of Kilimanjaro, although a lot less people climb it today, okay. It's not the most beautiful route, I would say, and again, you're going to top the crater rim of Kilimanjaro, Kibu, at the Gilman's Point, which is a very far distance away at 19,000 plus feet to Uhuru Peak. All right. So those are the drawbacks that I look at and say we can do better. We can do better. Now, if we move all the way to the other side, to the east, to the western part of the mountain, you have Shira and Lemosho, and I would say Lemosho is a lot more used than the Shira route. Okay, this is a plateau. This is a collapsed mountain from thousands and thousands of years ago, and a collapsed peak of Kilimanjaro. And so it's beautiful. They're beautiful routes. The problem is that they are so far off from the summit. And on paper, that tends to look good, right? Because you're like, oh, this is a 9-day itinerary. Oh, I actually can extend it to 10 to 14-day itinerary. And if I think about that from a beginner perspective, that's going to give me more time to acclimatize. I'll be stronger by the time I get to the high points of the mountain. And on paper, some things sound great, but it doesn't always translate. Because you see, guys, one thing you have to understand, I come from a mountain guiding perspective, and every mountain, I look at it as having a sweet spot, okay? So you definitely don't want to be on the one end where you're rushing up this mountain, especially if you lack the expertise and understand how to deal with altitude or even how you deal with altitude. And then on the other end, you don't want to be on the other side where you spend too much time, because what people don't realize is the exposure to high altitude, the exposure to being not in the best sleep environment, the exposure to food and water and all these other things that come out to sun, you're expressing potentially too long exposure to these elements, okay? And so let's put it to you this way. If you're not, most of the people that climb Kilimanjaro are not they're beginners. They're beginners, okay? And they're not used to camping. And even though we try to make things as comfortable as possible, it's still, you're not sleeping in your own bed. You're going to be sleeping at altitude. You're going to be trekking long hours. So you put all these things into the equation, sun exposure, then are you going to be sleeping your best? Now, on an extended itinerary, is that going to play out for you, where your potential immune system can come down? You get a bug. It doesn't have to be altitude sickness. It could be a bug, okay? So there's sweet spot. Think of it from a baseball. Again, I grew up playing baseball, and you know, the coach always said, when you hit that ball, you want to hit it in a sweet spot. So your swing, consistently correct all the time. If you can hit that ball on the sweet spot, it's going to go where you want it to go, home run. If you hit outside of it, it's going to be lesser potential to it. You hit further outside that sweet spot, and the potential drops even considerably even more. So the same when it comes to climbing mountains. And it's no different from climbing a mountain like Everest, K2, Annapurna, some of the biggest, most difficult mountains in the world. There's a sweet spot. Spending too much time at altitude is not going to translate to success. And rushing up the mountain is, again, not going to translate to success. So when you're looking at the Shira and the Lemosho route, to me, those extended itineraries are going to take people out by the time they get to the high camp of Mount Kilimanjaro and try to make that ascent up. They're going to be in a weakened state because they're outside that sweet spot, okay? Now, we've talked almost all the routes, and that's leading two ascent routes still, Marangu and Umbwe. Marango and Umbwe, they run almost identical to each other up the mountain. It's incredible. However, there's one distinct difference. And to me, that makes the difference in ultimately your success on Mount Kilimanjaro. So when you look at the map, the first 2 days up the Marango and the Umbwe route are almost identical when it comes to your camp spots as far as elevation goes. And to be honest with you, they're not far off from each other either. So the beauty of both is fairly unique as far as, one's not more beautiful than the other. I wouldn't say that the Marango route is more, the Machami route is more beautiful than the Umbwe and vice versa. However, there are walls when you get to on Mount Kilimanjaro. So the highest wall that people are going to hit on Kilimanjaro is right around 17,500 feet. Okay, there's not too many places on the planet that you can go that you're above 17,000 feet. So you're not going to really hit that wall until you're on your summit day. Okay, now the next wall below it is right around 13,000 feet. Now that's a wall that you're going to hit on any point on any of the routes on Kilimanjaro. Now the big difference between the Machami route and the Umbwe route is that the Barranco campsite, that's a golden campsite. So it's right at that 13,000 feet, give or take 500 feet, okay? We get there at that altitude on the end of day 2, okay, on both routes. You're either going to make it on the Machami route to Shira camp, or you're going to make it to the Barranco campsite on the Umbwe route, okay? Now on day 3, and day 3 is right after you hit that wall. So I want to just go back to the night of day 2, okay? And again, it's because I've seen this. What happens? People will hit the wall. The altitude sickness will start to spike during that time, okay? So you're either going to have a terrible night, you're going to have chills where you can't get warm, you're not going to want to eat, you're nauseous, you got a headache, it could be all of the above, okay? This is not fun when you're camping, even though you're going to be that well supported. And it can happen on either route, and it can happen to anybody if you don't have experience and you don't know how you deal at 13,000 feet. So now let's go back to day 3. On the Machami route, on day 3, you got to make a long trek from Shira camp all the way to Barranco. And that is going to top close to 15,000 feet. And the other thing is it's extremely exposed. You're not in the jungle anymore. You're pretty much in the moorland and the desert ranges of Mount Kilimanjaro. So you're out and you're exposed to the sun. So now if you're suffering on day 2, you got to travel about 9 hours now to get from one campsite to the other campsite. How do you think that's going to translate to your success and to your enjoyment and to your safety? Not very well. Okay, now move over to the Umbwe route and our itinerary, and this is where people get offended because they don't know the history of the Umbwe route. Same thing might happen. You might hit night 2 where you feel like hell. However, let's say you're in a group of 10, okay, and 5 people are fighting altitude sickness and the other 5 are not. We build in an acclimatization day there. We don't move camp. So for the people that are feeling great, feeling somewhat good, we can take you out for a half day and we can get some elevation, come back down. You see, a short day. Just get you out, get you to go a little bit higher, come back down. You're now expanding upon your acclimatization process. For the people, potentially 50% of the people are going to feel this the other way is terrible. You now have an opportunity to acclimatize a little bit longer. And guess what? You tend to feel better by the end of that day. You know why? Because acclimatization is basically a timed process. For some people, all it is, essentially, and I'm going to keep it really simple here, is how much red blood cells your body has now created to deal with the altitude. If you process and create new red blood cells faster than the average person, you're not going to feel altitude as much as the average person. If you take more time to develop those red blood cells. You're going to take longer to acclimatize. But the process is just timed, okay? So now if you have an extra 24 hours to work on that, guess what? Those extreme chills, your body is now going to be able to warm itself up naturally. That nauseousness that you felt, those migraines that you felt, they will slowly start to dissipate. That's all it is, okay? Now, I'm not saying that every person is going to eventually acclimatize. There's always people that just don't acclimatize, and we're going to have to send them down. I'm not talking, it's not necessarily a big number. Don't get me wrong, guys. There's exceptions to every rule. There's 8 billion people on this planet. We are going to find a collection of people that will be on Kilimanjaro that just can't acclimatize above 13,000 feet, okay? Although it's a very small percentage of the population, but it does happen. Just like on the other end, you're going to find people can acclimatize to any altitude of any mountain, okay, naturally, without supplemental oxygen. So I want that to be clear to you guys. There's a reason why myself, my company, we always recommend unveil route. Now, why does it have that distinction? Okay, when you look on the interwebs of having the hardest reputation, because of the Western Breach. Back in the day, in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, and even in the early 2000s, and I've done this route too, and I've done this route with clients as well. The unveil route is the most direct route to the summit. So that's why people will say, okay, you have to be very experienced, and you have to have a history of climbing at altitude so you know how you do. You don't want to bring beginners up this route, because you could go straight up unveil, past Barranco to the lava tower and the Aero Glacier camp, which is basically the high camp, and then you basically go right up the Western Breach, which is a rocky faced wall that is not technical, but more rugged to get to the crater rim, and then eventually the peak of Mount Kilimanjaro. And you could do this very quickly, hence why it has that reputation. But we don't do that. We only use the bottom part of unveil to allow you to have that acclimatization once you hit that first wall. Then what we do is we connect with all the other routes. We connect with Shira, Lemosho, Machami. But what we've done now is we've created a base for you at that 13,000 foot wall. Okay, and that base is now going to help you when you get to 16,000 feet, which is basically your high camp on Kilimanjaro, and eventually your summit night. Okay, so don't take offense when you look at our information package, because I've been approached by so many people and say, you don't know what you're doing, you have no idea. And this is to a person that's personally climbed Kilimanjaro over 50 times, and I've guided people successfully over 3 decades up Mount Kilimanjaro. Yet I still get from people that have never done it before, because they've researched themselves on how to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, that I don't know what I'm doing. Okay? Now, again, I'm not limited to any one route. Keep that in mind. I'm here to help you guys understand that that route selection is going to hit the sweet spot on Mount Kilimanjaro the best. It's going to allow you guys to spend just enough time on that mountain to enjoy, to do it safely, and do it successfully. That's why we have that success that we do with over 30 years. We've done it all: the Breach, the Rongai, the Marangu, the Machami, Shira, Lemosho. We've done them all. We always do unveil because that is the best route. And now how do I know? Because I've done the other routes. So thank you for listening, guys. Understand where it's coming from, a common sense approach. And if you liked this video, please hit like, subscribe, comment below, share it with anybody that you know that might want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with you. And don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask for our information package. And after you watch this video, now you have a better understanding. And when you meet with me, you also have a better understanding with how to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. We can talk about other things, okay? Or we can talk about, again, the whys of climbing unveil over all the other ascent routes, okay? Thank you for listening, guys. Appreciate it.